So another bunch of students followed this guy we now know as the Buddha. But like Jesus of Nazareth and like Confucius, Buddha never wrote a single word. He talked, but he didn't write not one syllable. So instead, we have this group of followers who assembled around this guy, and more came, and even when he died, they continued to tell the stories and the sayings and share the wisdom of this guy. So the story of Buddha kind of goes something like there was this rich, handsome, beautiful prince who lived someplace up in northeast India, somewhere around 500 BCE, although the dates are disputed. It's an interesting thing to sort of make a comparative timeline of all these great thinkers, these teachers who spawned these texts and the years and places that they happened. But they all happened around this time, this 500 years. 500 to 0. If Jesus is 0, he's probably the latest of the bunch. But there was a lot going on, this teaching bubbling up around in different parts of the world. But this prince happened to live in northeastern India. And the rumor goes that he lived a life of comfort, a life of beauty, and at one point, but he was kept inside his castle. His father wanted to protect him from all that was outside so that his life could be lovely. And he got to 17, 18, said, I really want to go out and see the world. And so the dad gets ready for this grand parade. The prince can come out and see. And everything was prepared. Everything, the parade routes were lined with flowers and song and people celebrating so that nothing could disturb the prince. Everything went great, except got up there for a while, looked down, and all of a sudden he saw this horrible, ugly thing. This man with folds and wrinkles, and he was an old man. He'd never seen anything as ugly as an old man before. He was horrified, ran back to the palace and said, "What was that?" And his king father had to explain that's old age. You haven't been exposed to that. And so this was repeated both with another parade where he encountered illness and another parade where he counted death. And so this privileged prince was horrified and deeply disturbed by these three awful things, left the palace completely. His world was turned upside down, and he decided to respond by living as a mendicant, as a spiritual, impoverished beggar who would do nothing, beg for food and pray. And so he followed the paths of other naked, barefoot mendicants, these wild spiritual souls, denying all of the luxuries of material wealth. And he did this for a while, and he got skinnier and skinnier and hungrier and was on the edge of death. And finally, really wrought to nothing. This woman gave him some milk so he could survive, and he sat down under a fig tree to think about what had happened. And he really hadn't been enlightened. He had just been suffering. And this suffering hadn't really brought any spiritual enlightenment. So he meditated and meditated and meditated and had a great and wondrous vision that this life was not his only life, that there were lives upon lives, and so on and so forth. And stood up after a while, after this calm meditation under the fig tree, and experienced enlightenment, and stood up and rose as now the Buddha, the enlightened one, and began teaching what he had learned. And so that's the origin story of the Buddha, this rich prince who had experienced deprivation and thought about it and realized, wow, this is how the world really works. The world as we know it is kind of distorted. And so one of the he went and he shared his sayings with his followers. His followers assembled. They listened to him. They followed him, and he starved himself no longer. But he continued to live a very, very simple life. Simple clothing, simple food, rhythms of the day, followed by rhythms of silence, contemplation, and meditation practices, and that became the cornerstone of the Buddhist life. He died. There was great consternation among his followers, and they collected his sayings in collections so that they could preserve the conversations that the students had with this great teacher. And one of those collections became known as the Diamond Sutra. Sutra simply means saying or rule. It comes from the word thread, a thread of conversation or thread of a life that come together to create the fabric of a life well lived. So the Diamond Sutra was simply this beautiful collection of sayings by which the followers of the Buddha might live. So for years and years and years, it was an oral tradition. It spread through India. It spread up through India into China, became very, very popular in southern China. The first written versions that we have left were written as late as a set of print blocks, of wood blocks in 868. So this is the 9th century in the Common Era. Buddha lived in 500, and this is 5, and then another 5 and 4. That's 4,000 years later of circulation among these different groups of followers, different sects who developed different ways of collecting, holding on, and repeating the sayings and the practices that were taught by that great teacher. So there's just a little overview, very, very, very brief, of this dude and of how this text that we're looking at arose. And come back in a few minutes, and I will tell you what I'd like you to do with your own version of the sutras and with your reading as an example of, as a way of reading in the way of Buddha's students for your discussion board this week. See you in just a minute.